Welcome, life science learners, to another installment. Today, we're focusing on homeostasis, specifically looking at thermoregulation. Quite an interesting concept, how the body regulates our temperature. In the context of homeostasis, we need to recollect what we've done over the past couple lessons. So we've looked at how the body carries out homeostasis in terms of as a concept of maintaining a sense of control over various activities in the body. We also looked at different mechanisms of homeostasis. For example, we looked at how the body maintains our blood glucose levels at a constant concentration. We've also looked at how the body maintains a carbon dioxide level within a constant range or a normal range. We've also spent some time looking at how the body controls the amount of salt and water in the blood. And these are all mechanisms of homeostasis where the balance is created. Today we're going to focus on the mechanisms of thermoregulation. And so we're going to unpack during the course of this lesson what is thermoregulation, how is that a mechanism of homeostasis, and we're going to try and unpack what happens in the body to keep the body temperature at a constant level. So let's get straight into this. So have you ever thought about why dogs pant and why lizards sunbathe? And you see this often in summer when dogs have had a good run, and you find them that they open their mouths and they let their tongues hang out and they breathe in or out a lot of air. And you feel this if you're close to them, you feel this hot air from their breath. Now, that is a mechanism that they use to control their body temperature. You would also see that in summer, lizards tend to come out and they bask in the sun, or even in winter, you find them sitting on a rock perched. And that's again their mechanism of heating up or sunbathing. We also tend to do this. We tend to do this in summer. We tend to do this in winter. In winter, we tend to sit in the sun and try and soak up the sun to heat us. And it feels good. Lots of animals do this as well. And so it's part of regulating their body temperature. You often feel that in winter sometimes we huddle together and we try and contain the body heat so that we feel warmer. You find that people sit closer together in winter. In summer, we're much more relaxed and we kind of remove our heavy clothes off so that we can feel a bit cooler. So those are all mechanisms that we kind of adopt to keep our temperatures within the constant normal range. So that's the reason. So there are lots of signs in nature that talk about various mechanisms that organisms or animals use to regulate their body temperature. So, as a concept overview, we're going to recap what the definition of homeostasis is. We're going to look at, as a recap, how homeostasis occurs in the body. It's important that we talk of negative feedback, and then we'll get straight into the details of thermoregulation. So as a recap, some of the key words that we have used and we will continue to use today is homeostasis, again, maintaining a constant internal environment. The concept of negative feedback. So the word negative again refers to the word opposite, and so there's a mechanism that responds to the change in an opposite manner. So remember, the words negative means opposite and a feedback is a response. So it's a response in an opposite manner. Thermoregulation as temperature being regulated, and in this mechanisms we have receptors that receive a stimulus, and we have an effector that responds to that stimulus to bring about a change. Two important terms that we will unpack today would be ectothermic. So again, the word ecto refers to external. So these are individuals that do not have control of their body temperature but rely on the external environment to regulate the temperature. And we have individuals that have a constant internal temperature, and we refer to them as endothermic. And we are, as mammals, we are examples of those organisms that actually have a constant internal temperature. Metabolism as a term that refers to all the activities that occur in the body, and cellular respiration as one of those crucial metabolic processes that produces heat and energy in our body. The concept of what happens when the body heats up excessively higher than the normal range, and we refer to that as hyper. So think of the hypermarket that you go to. It's a big store, so it's high, large increase in temperature, and then hypo. I often use the word low to remind me that these are individuals or temperatures that are extremely low, lower than the normal range. So low, hypo, hyperthermia, extremely high temperatures. Cool. So again, a recap of what homeostasis is, and as I mentioned this in our previous lessons, homeo meaning same, and stasis constant. So a similar constant mechanism that's being maintained in the body. So homeostasis refers to the constant internal environment that is maintained. And so there are various processes that need to be kept constant, and so the body has to constantly use different mechanisms to maintain a balance. And I mentioned examples of your blood pressure, your blood sugar levels, your carbon dioxide levels, the blood water volume, and salt concentrations. These all need to be kept within a normal range, which is a part of what we could refer to as homeostasis. Right. So again, as I unpack that, so it's a constant internal environment that is being maintained. And the internal environment refers to the blood and the tissue fluid that surrounds the cells of the body. And that's essentially what the internal environment is. Homeostasis enables the body to function efficiently despite the changes that might occur in the external or the internal environment. And so essentially, this brings us back to the concept of how the body maintains its temperature regardless of what happens externally. So you know that in winter you feel extremely cold and lots of the heat is lost to the environment. And that's the mechanism that the body needs to do in terms of regulate the temperature. So no matter what happens, we shiver, we consume warm drinks, and that's to increase the body temperature. So those are all parts of the mechanisms that we incorporate in our regulation of the body temperature. Right, so again, an overview. We said that in order for this mechanism to function and remain in balance, there needs to be a stimulus that is picked up by a receptor cell, and that receptor area then processes that information and sends it through the control center, which could be the brain, it could be certain cells in the body that identifies the stimulus and then responds to that with the effector organ or muscle bringing about a change. And that change then responds to the stimulus and maintains what we refer to as the balance in the body. And so we have these four components that we need to remember. And so I'm going to quickly skip through to that. And it's the stimulus that is received, a sensor or a receptor that responds to that, and then the control center that processes that information and then sends out a signal or a message to an effector to bring about change so that the conditions can return back to normal. So please remember these four components of the cycle of homeostasis. Again, this is the overview of the concept of negative feedback that we've discussed, and there are 7 steps in describing this, and I'll go through that again. So the first step is that an imbalance is detected. The second is that a control center is stimulated. That control center then sends a response, and that response is sent via a message to a target organ or the effector organ. The target organ then responds, so the effector organ responds it in an opposite or a reverse manner to change the imbalance, thereby bringing the balance back to normal. So we refer to this as the 7 steps in maintaining homeostasis using the negative feedback mechanism. I'll remind you again that negative meaning the opposite, and feedback is a response. And so this is essentially how the responses are brought back to normal using this mechanism. Cool. So it is important that we unpack what thermoregulation is. Again, let's break up the word thermo and regulation into 2 parts. Thermo refers to temperature, and regulation refers to the process of keeping that temperature constant. Now, have you ever wondered about how the temperature in the water that comes out from your geyser remains constant? What we have in the geyser is a thermostat, and that thermostat ensures that the temperature fluctuates around a specific temperature. So that might be set at 60 degrees Celsius, and so when the water boils, it will switch off at that temperature and then switch back on when the water cools down. And that's a mechanical process of keeping the temperature constant. Interestingly, the body has similar mechanisms that actually control the temperature, monitors them, and ensures that certain things happen in the body. For example, vasodilation, vasoconstriction, or sweating, or us having to drink a warm drink to bring our temperatures back to normal. So let's unpack those interesting concepts in terms of how we regulate our body temperature. So the temperature regulation is the control of the temperature, which is to be kept close to 37 degrees Celsius. And this is important for the body to function normally. Body temperature is regulated by an important center in the brain called the hypothalamus. And again, remember that we discussed the hypothalamus as a control center in the brain, controlling various important physiological processes. We discussed this yesterday when we spoke about how it controls the level of carbon dioxide. Today we're looking at how it controls the level of your body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. And so this is an important control center in the body. Along with that, we will look at the blood vessels as well as the sweat glands in the skin in terms of maintaining the body temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. Why is thermoregulation important? Why is it important that we keep our body temperatures constant? I'll draw you back to grade 10, where we looked at how enzymes function optimally at a specific temperature. Remember that enzymes need to function optimally at 37 degrees Celsius in the body. What does this mean if the temperature changes? Remember that enzymes are protein in nature. So when our temperatures increase above the normal optimal temperature, we will experience what we call the denaturation of these proteins. So these enzymes break down and do not function. So important physiological processes cannot take place. However, when the temperatures also decrease below the normal, it means that these enzymes become inactive, not able to carry out their function. So let's remember that maintaining the temperature is important for enzymatic functioning as well as maintaining metabolism in the body. So the humans normally maintain their body temperature around 37 degrees Celsius, and this relatively high temperature is critical to human survival. And as I mentioned, that enzymes also function at that temperature optimally. Before we continue in terms of the classification of organisms based on their temperature, let's reconnect with what we've done in this segment. So we've looked at what thermoregulation is. We've unpacked the idea that thermoregulation is a homeostatic mechanism, and it's important because a vital enzymes function at an optimum temperature. So you guys need to now take a little break. Let's process what we've done. We'll come back after a break and we will look at how we classify organisms based on their ability to control their body temperatures. We will look at then the mechanisms of thermoregulation in the body, and then we'll attempt to look at other concepts as well. So you guys can have a little stretch break, grab some water, and see you in a bit. Welcome back, guys, from the ad break. I hope you guys had a chance to unwind, kind of regulate your temperatures by walking around a bit. Remember, today's lesson is on thermoregulation. Let's look at how we classify organisms based on their ability to either control their temperature or rely on the environment in terms of maintaining their body temperatures. Now we'll draw examples about how animals behave differently in terms of maintaining their body temperature. Let's look at the broad classification based on the ability to control their body temperatures. So we can classify organisms based on how they regulate their core temperature. We might have come across the terms cold-blooded or warm-blooded animals. It's quite an old term. It's very casually used in terms of the blood being cold. However, it really does not mean that these individuals have cold blood. It essentially points to their ability to control their body temperature versus those that actually have the ability to keep their body's temperatures at a constant internal temperature or range. So based on the temperature regulation and their adaptations towards balancing the gain and loss in the body temperature, we find that we can classify them into two groups. And I'll pause and I'll go through this slowly. It's called ectothermic, and again the word ecto refers to something on the outside. So these rely on the external temperatures to control their body temperatures, whereas the individuals that are endothermic, again, this refers to an internal temperature regulation at a core temperature being within a normal range. So these are the two classification systems that we're going to be looking at. So what does ectothermic mean? So they are commonly called cold-blooded. It's sometimes referred to as poikilothermic, and I'm not going to try and expand on that. So poikilothermic, again, ectothermic or cold-blooded mean the same. So these are individuals that basically do not have a mechanism internally to regulate their temperature. So you find that they gain most of their heat from the external source. So we can refer to them as sunning or basking in the sun. And as I mentioned at the start, you'd notice that in winter, you'll find that certain reptiles come out and they bask on hot rocks and they absorb that heat from there to increase their body temperatures. We also see this behavior in summer and winter with mammals and how they try and avoid the unfavorable conditions. And the concepts of hibernation is another mechanism that mammals use to reduce their heat, and we'll discuss that in a moment. So these individuals that are ectothermic produce very less amount of heat, and hence they keep their bodies warm, and they keep their metabolic rates low in terms of the ability to produce heat. Examples of these animals include amphibians. So these are those that have both the ability to live on land and water, fish, lizards, and other reptiles. And often we see reptiles that show this behavior. So if you've seen, again in summer or in winter, when a reptile will bask in the sun or sunbathe, you'll find that it soaks up or it heats up its body from the radiation in terms of absorbing the radiation from the sun. We also know that there is, on a heated surface, that there's lots of conduction from that heat surface that these reptiles absorb through their lower body or their ventral surface, or their dorsal surface rather. That means their lower body surface that they absorb heat through, along with the ability to lose heat through convection. They're able to also lose heat through evaporation, and we see this when they open their jaws and they kind of let off heat through their mouths. And this is an example of how an ectothermic individual or organism maintains its body temperature. Let's look at the term endothermic. So these are commonly called warm-blooded individuals, and I refer to them also as homeothermic. Homeo, again, thermic, homeo is same, and thermic refers to same temperature. So the ability to keep their body temperatures the same. So they develop most of their heat mainly through the body from metabolism. So again, the processes that happen through respiration, and they produce the required amount of heat to keep their body temperature within what we refer to as a normal range. So these animals have a very high metabolic rate, which means that cellular respiration occurs constantly to keep their body temperatures within their normal range. So they rely on cellular respiration, and examples of these would include all your mammals and birds. And so these are generally your ectotherms that have a normal range, and hence you'll see that birds often sit on their eggs and they keep their temperatures at a specific temperature which is very close to the mother's body core temperature. And that's again important indication of how we see ectothermic animals giving birth to, or actually incubating their eggs. If we think of reptiles and lizards, they often do not sit on their eggs or incubate their eggs, and so they rely on the environmental temperatures which could influence how the egg development takes place. So that's another indication of how these individuals or groups of individuals differ from each other. Right, so an example of an ectothermic animal are the endothermic animals are your Arctic foxes. And if you think of your polar bears, again, these individuals are able to withstand some of the harshest, coldest climates on the earth. And it's not just the ability to be able to regulate their body temperatures, but their behavior as well. So you will find that during extremely cold conditions, polar bears or grizzly bears will hibernate, consume a lot of food during the feeding frenzy, and produce a lot of fat in their body that allows them to insulate and keep warm. So those are mechanisms and behavior changes that these endothermic animals adopt to keep their temperatures constant. Right, so heat production in the human body. The main source of heat production is cellular respiration, which occurs in all living cells. An increase in secretion of adrenaline and thyroxine. Again, thyroxine is produced from the thyroid gland, which maintains your basal metabolic rate. And this will result in an increased metabolic rate. Consequently, the respiration rate increases and more heat is released. Now, it's important that we understand that sometimes you find that individuals tend to have a high metabolic rate. So their metabolism is generally faster. You will find that they produce large amounts of heat in their body through simple physiological or exertion. And that means that they generally heat up quicker. You find that they sweat much easier. And that's their mechanism that the body uses to maintain their core temperature. You find other individuals also tend to feel much colder at times, and it could be an indication of a low metabolic rate. If we look at the endocrine abnormalities associated with thyroxine levels, and an indication of having constant frequent shivering could indicate that this individual is having some endocrine problem, and that would mean that they possibly have a low metabolic rate. It could be a sign of them having metabolic abnormalities with thyroxine levels. So again, signals that we look at in terms of how the body maintains the core temperature. Right. So heat can be absorbed from the environment by activities such as consuming warm foods as well as fluids, or exposing the body to heat such as the sun or fire or heating appliances. And we know that during winter, guys, we often tend to consume more warmer beverages. We tend to enjoy a warm meal, or we tend to bask or sit close to the fireplace or even an appliance. And that's all part of actually increasing the temperature that is surrounding us so that we can absorb some of that heat and reduce the heat loss from our body through convection. So again, this is how we produce heat, or we maintain our heat in the body during cooler weathers. Heat loss in the body is an important process, and this is how it occurs. It occurs through the following processes, and these are physical processes that we don't have control over. So there's a tendency for heat to be lost through radiation, and that's the body giving off the heat. There's heat loss through convection, and that's to the air surrounding us, as well as through conduction. So when you sit on an object and that's cool, you will tend to lose heat to that object. And so you'll find that some of that heat from your body is lost to the colder object, and that's conduction. And we often tend to, in winter, place our hands underneath on our seat, and we sit on them, and that's to reduce the heat loss. So these are mechanisms that occur without us consciously being aware of what happens. There's also evaporation from the surface of the skin, where lots of that heat is lost. So again, this illustration shows you how heat is lost in the body. So there is infrared radiation, as I mentioned, so that's the heat that's given off. There's conduction of the heat from our skin to the air surrounding our body. We tend to shiver, which is a mechanism to generate heat, and that heat is lost to the surrounding. We also exhale lots of warm air through which heat is lost. And the core body temperature is maintained through metabolism, which is what is lost to the surrounding. And as I said, we tend to perspire or sweat, and that sweat evaporates and cools the body down. So these mechanisms are all mechanisms that allow for the loss of heat from our body. Okay, so let's look at the structure which is an important organ in maintaining our body temperatures within a normal range. And that organ is the skin. Yes, guys, the skin is an organ. So if you think about why we classify it as an organ, think of what skin is made up of. It's made up of cells and tissues that perform a specific function. So collectively, we've got various tissues that perform collectively a single function, and we look at how the organ, which is the skin, is an important organ in thermoregulation. Before we get into understanding how the skin serves as thermoregulator, it's important that we look at the structure of the skin. And we know that the skin is made up of different layers. The uppermost layer is called the epidermis, and it's got a layer below that called the dermis. We know that when we looked at the structure of the skin, we see that on the surface of the skin, we've got a layer of squamous epithelium, a flat layer of cells. Okay? The skin has obviously lots of hair follicles, and these hair follicles are basically a mechanism that the body uses to maintain body temperature. And I'll talk about what happens on a winter day and a summer day in a bit. But the hair follicles have a muscle attached to them at the root. And this muscle is called the hair erector muscle. And the ability of this muscle is that it can contract or relax, causing the hair follicle to stand upright or to lie flat. And this is one mechanism that we see in many other animals where they use the erector muscles effectively to trap air underneath the hair. So air becomes an important conductor for conserving heat. And so you would notice that sometimes you have goosebumps, and those goosebumps in winter are the hair follicles standing erect. And that when the hair stands erect, it forms a trap for air. So the hair traps air, and it allows the air around your skin to warm up. And that's one mechanism which traps the air, keeping the body warm. Now, yes, we don't have much hair on the surface of our body, but if you think of other animals, a dog, or probably some of the wild animals, you'll find that when they're cold, you'll find that their body hair stands erect. And that traps the air around the surface of their body, keeping the air warm. And that air becomes a good conductor to maintaining the body temperature. And that's why we've got hair, which does help us, but it's not as significant as some of the wild animals that we know that have their body surfaces covered with dense hair or fur. Okay? We also have the dermis layer, richly supplied with blood vessels. We see them here, and we're going to talk about the role of these blood vessels in terms of how they control or regulate the loss of heat. We see that there are fat cells in our skin which serve as a mechanism to regulate the loss of heat. Not significant in humans, but we find this in wild animals that hibernate. You'll find that they produce a lot of fat or adipose tissue, adipose as in tissue below the skin, which serves as a fat insulating layer, often seen in bears that hibernate. We also know that there are sweat glands that produce sweat, and that sweat is an important mechanism of controlling and cooling the body temperature down. Okay, let's move on to the concept of vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Vasodilation, again, is made up of two words. Vaso referring to the vessels, and dilation refers to the ability of the vessels to dilate. Now, vasodilation refers to how vessels increase their diameter, causing more blood to flow through them. The other term that we need to expose you to is called vasoconstriction. So the constriction would be the narrowing of blood capillaries. And these two mechanisms allow for increased circulation of blood to the skin or decreasing the circulation of blood to the skin. Now let's think of what happens on a hot summer day. You walk out, you feel that your face is much warmer, it looks sometimes dark red in color, and you feel heat in your ears on the surface of your face and even on your fingertips. Now that's a mechanism that the body introduces to regulate the body temperature. So that is when vasodilation happens. So there's increased blood circulation to your fingers, to your face, and even your ears, and that allows for more heat to be lost. On the other hand, during a cold day in winter, we find that there's vasoconstriction. So the blood vessels reduce the amount of blood flowing to the surface of the skin. So that means there's less blood, warm blood, towards the surface, and hence reduce heat loss to the surrounding. And hence, if you look at someone in winter, we tend to be much pale. Our ears feel much cooler than they normally are. You can place your fingers against your face and you feel it cooler. And that's because there's reduced blood circulation or flow to the periphery or the fingertips and the ear tips. Even your toes tend to get much cooler. And that's again a mechanism that the body has to reduce the blood supply and heat loss to the surrounding. So guys, we ended off this session with looking at vasodilation and vasoconstriction, and that's again a mechanism to reduce heat loss or to retain the heat. So guys, you've done well. You deserve a break. Have a stretch, grab some water, and we'll see you in a bit. Welcome back, Life Science learners, to the final segment of today's lesson. A recap of what we've done. We've looked at thermoregulation as a mechanism to regulate the body temperature. We've spent some time unpacking the mechanism of negative feedback. We've looked at the concepts of what ectothermic and endothermic organisms are. Just before we went into the break, we looked at vasoconstriction and vasodilation. I want to spend some time on that concept, and then we'll move on to the terms such as hypothermia and hypothermia. So before we went into the break, I mentioned the terms vasodilation and vasoconstriction. And here I've illustrated what a blood vessel would look like under normal conditions. And here we see that we've got a large lumen that's relatively open, allowing for the movement of blood. However, the word constriction refers to the closing, so the narrowing of the blood vessel. And if we compare the lumen in this diagram, which is the normal diagram, to the lumen, which is the opening of the blood vessel, we see that it is significantly smaller and or narrower, and that's a better term to describe them, narrower. And this means that there is a reduced circulation of blood through this vessel. Again, it means that there is less heat that's going to be lost through these blood capillaries or vessels. So again, a mechanism of constriction is to reduce heat loss through the blood vessels. Vasodilation, on the other hand, refers to the dilation of the blood vessel. If we compare that to the narrow lumen in the normal, we can see that it is significantly dilated or much more wider. And this means that there is large amounts of blood that can travel through this, which in turn means that there's greater loss of heat. So vasodilation would be essentially a mechanism to lose heat, and vasoconstriction would be a mechanism to conserve the heat. So we're conserving the heat in our body through this mechanism. Right, so again, an illustration showing you the comparisons between the blood vessels in a person that has been exposed to heat and a person that is experiencing convection to reduce the heat loss. So here we look at vasoconstriction, and you can see that the blood vessels are significantly narrower and there is a reduced blood circulation, and hence you find that there is less blood going to the surface, and it actually passes the epidermis and it remains in the dermal layer. However, in vasodilation, you can see that these blood vessels are dilated. There is an increased supply of blood to the dermal layer, the epidermis, sorry, and that means that there is greater loss of heat now to the surrounding, which means that the body now can lose some of that heat and maintain the core temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. So these mechanisms are important in us understanding. Let's compare these in a table by looking at what happens on a hot day and a cold day. So on a hot day, there is vasodilation, which means that the arterioles or arteries, which are branches of arteries called arterioles, dilate. Dilate again refers to them enlarging their lumen so that there is more blood that enters the skin and heat is lost to the surrounding. However, on a cold day, there is vasoconstriction. Again, the arterioles, which are branches of arteries, become smaller, the lumen becomes smaller, and there is reduced blood circulation to the skin, containing the heat, keeping the core temperature much warmer. On a hot day, we know that we sweat a lot, and so we've got glands called sweat glands that reduce or that produce more sweat, and that sweat moves to the surface of the skin, removing the heat as well as allowing for the evaporation and the cooling of the skin. On a cold day, you know that we tend to shiver, and shivering is a mechanism of rapid contraction of the muscles in the body, and this allows for heat to be produced by respiration in order to warm the body up. We also know that the hair flattens on a hot day, and that's called pyelorelaxation. So essentially the hair follicles relax and the hair flattens, whereas on a cold day we see that the hair follicles stand upright because the erector muscles contract and cause the hair to stand upright on the skin. And as I said, air is a good conductor of heat, and that is trapped in the hair follicles and remains as a thermoregulating surface or insulation layer. We also tend to stretch out our bodies, and you will see this in terms of how we stand on a hot day. We tend to kind of expose our body to a large surface area to lose more heat, whereas on a cold day we tend to curl up, huddle up together, and we embrace ourselves, reducing the surface area so that there's less heat exposed to the surrounding. In this slide now, we're going to look at what the concept of hypothermia is. Again, hyper means there's an increase of the core body temperature, which is above the normal 36 to 37.5 degrees Celsius that we normally experience. When this happens, we say that the body temperature is excessively high, and we refer to that as hypothermia. This could occur because of various factors. It could be because of extreme physical exertion. It could be because of extremely high external temperatures, or it could be because of an infection where the body produces a fever. And that's again a mechanism to increase the core temperature of the body to denature the enzymes of the pathogen or the bacteria or virus that is infecting you. So what happens next is that during a hypothermia, there is a high temperature which causes an increase in sweating. This leads to dehydration, which reduces the sweating and allows the core body temperature to rise. This often occurs when we don't drink sufficient water or when it is hot. It can happen also because of prolonged exercise. Symptoms of hypothermia include an increased body temperature, hot and dry skin, so you feel the surface of your skin and it's really hot, rapid heartbeat, so your heart rate increases, there's an increase or sometimes a decrease in the blood pressure, you feel your head is sore and you experience headaches, there's sometimes confusion, and you could even pass out and fall unconscious. And these are again due to the rapid destruction or denaturation of important enzymes due to extremely high temperatures. Let's look at hypothermia. And hypothermia occurs when the core temperature falls below 35 degrees Celsius. And it happens when the body is losing heat faster than it can produce that heat. So you get different levels of hypothermia, where we experience mild hypothermia, where the temperature is below 32 to 35 degrees Celsius. We have moderate hypothermia, which is again significantly lower than the core temperature, and we have severe hypothermia, and this is often experienced where people have ended up in adventure sports where they're exposed to the harsh environmental temperatures, such as in mountain climbing in areas like the Himalayas, where it's extremely cold, and you'll find that they experience rapid heat loss, and that could severely compromise their ability to function. And these are the symptoms. So violent shivering, which stops hypothermia and becomes more severe with time. There's confusion, dementia, and they find it difficult to move because now you find that muscles are contracting and not producing the generated heat that is required. Symptoms of people that experience hypothermia are tiredness, slurred speech, slow and shallow breathing, and a weak pulse, because that also affects the heart and how the heart functions. So guys, we've come to almost the end of the segment, but I'd like to very quickly look at one question before we wrap this up. The graph on the next slide shows the effect of strenuous exercise followed by a cold shower on the body temperature of an athlete. And we tend to do this. So after exercising, we tend to go and have a cold shower, and that helps to keep the body temperature lower. So this diagram illustrates what has happened after a strenuous exercise, and it shows you what happens when we have a cold shower at 18 degrees Celsius. The body temperature here is indicated as the dependent variable, and we can see the comparisons between the blood vessels here, showing an image, diagram 1, where there is vasodilation. You can see that the vessels are much thicker, whereas here in diagram 2 there is vasoconstriction. So essentially what happens during the strenuous exercise is that the core body temperature tends to increase a bit. Again, that is from the heat produced during cellular respiration in the mitochondria, and that heat increases the core temperature about 0.5 degrees Celsius. However, after the end of the exercise, the body cools down, there is sweating that occurs, there's increased breathing rate, there's vasodilation that occurs, which is where we find there's more heat lost. We then have a shower, which is much cooler, and you'll see that that helps to cool the body temperature down, bringing that back to the normal range or even below that. And we tend to cool down, and we have the sense of comfort in knowing that the body has cooled down. And this is essentially an illustration of that process. So I'd like to take you through to one of the questions. And so before we end this session up, why should the body temperature not be allowed to fluctuate too much? And as we wrap this up, I'm going to talk about the importance of this mechanism. So again, it's important that temperature remains constant. And the reason why we do that is we have enzymes in the body that function optimally at 36.5 to 37 degrees Celsius. If we have a prolonged increase in body temperature, we know that it's going to affect enzyme functioning, and it will result in symptoms like reduced enzyme activity, affecting the cognitive ability of an individual to think, to process, confusion, dementia, slowed heart rate, etc. So guys, you've done well. We've been focused on this concept of homeostasis and thermoregulation. We've looked at lots of concepts around how the body maintains the body temperature using vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And remember that the skin is an important organ in this process as maintaining the body temperature. So as a recap, look at the structure of the skin, unpack the concepts of vasodilation and vasoconstriction, and prepare these sections pretty well. This is important in understanding homeostasis. As we wrap up the section, thank you for staying tuned. Wish you well. Keep safe, stay warm, stay cold, and thermoregulate. Take care. Bye.